So here is the central question of today. Is physician-assisted suicide morally permissible? Now, in this section, we've been covering arguments for physician-assisted suicide. In the next section, we'll cover arguments against. But in this video, I wanted to cover a very important, kind of a very popular argument given by James Rachels in a 1975 article. So that's what we're going to do here, because it kind of shows this tension between the for and against positions and pretty standard ways to argue for some ethical conclusion. So Rachels 1975 argues that current practices which do not allow physician-assisted suicide are based on a problematic doctrine which Rachels calls the conventional doctrine. So I might add that this is 1975, right? So you have to kind of, slide everything back a couple of decades. But the general idea here that you should be looking at is that Rachels is first going to attack his opponent's view. He's going to say, well, look, those who are opposed to physician-assisted suicide base their arguments on a flawed doctrine. He calls it the conventional doctrine. So first he's going to go after that, and then he's going to put forward his own argument for physician-assisted suicide. Moreover, we should allow physician-assisted suicide, Rachels argues, because this would decrease the hardship of those with terminal diseases. So let's look at each of these two steps that Rachels is taking. First, critiquing his opponent's views, and then putting forward his own view. So let's look at the conventional doctrine. So this is what he calls it. It was basically the official policy at the time. Things are changing now, but here's what it says. It is permissible to discontinue treatment resulting in ending someone's life, but not permissible to actively aid someone in ending their life. In other words, it's okay to let someone die, but it's not okay to actively bring about their death. So there is clearly a subtle difference here. It's the difference between, pulling the plug and discontinuing treatment, or actually, injecting them or providing for them some kind of barbiturates so they can end their life. So there is, it might not seem like a massive difference, but at least from perhaps the doctor's perspective, there is a big difference. So this is a conventional doctrine, and Rachels makes the case that those who oppose physician-assisted suicide are essentially relying on this. That may or may not be true, but so at least Rachels is moving forward, assuming that this is sort of their main weapon for arguing for their position. So what Rachels is going to do is he's going to actually give you an example of a situation where there is no moral difference between letting someone die and actively bringing about their death. So his famous example is sort of referred to as the case of Smith and Jones. And yes, I drew these myself. So Smith and Jones are both going to be inheriting a large sum of money when their niece dies. And let's not get into the backstory here, just assume that it's true. And so they both have a financial incentive to bring about the death of their niece, adorable as she may be. Now, what Smith does is he plans on drowning his niece. It seems like the easiest way to go about it. So he walks into the bathroom while she's taking a bath and drowns her. So he actively brings about her death. Jones had the exact same plan. And by the way, this is a different niece that apparently looks identical. Jones had the exact same plan, except when he walked into the bathroom, the niece slipped or hit her head or something, and she was underneath the water. And he could have rescued her. He could have taken her out. But he just let her die instead, let her drown. So I know these are pretty gruesome thought experiments here, but here is the main message that James Rachels is trying to get across. Smith actively brought about his niece's death. Jones just let his niece die. But it really doesn't seem like there's a big moral difference between their behaviors. So Rachel's puts forward a modus tollens. Modus tollens, by the way, is just an argument form that's valid at least. So you have to look at the premises to see if it's true or not. So premise one, if the conventional doctrine is true, then Jones behaved better than Smith. Recall that the conventional doctrine says it's okay to let someone die, but not to actively bring about their death. Well, in that case, Jones, who just let his niece die, he behaved better than Smith, who actively brought about her death. Of course, anyone that hears this story will probably agree that Jones did not behave better than Smith. In other words, it seems that both did something morally wrong. And it seems clearly that it's the same degree of wrongness. So that is at least pretty intuitive. Therefore, the conventional doctrine must be false. So let's just make sure we understand everything that's going on here. Rachel's is just saying, look, my opponents, those who oppose physician-assisted suicide, basically use as their main thesis the conventional doctrine. But the conventional doctrine is extremely counterintuitive, and he gives you an example, the example of Jones and Smith, where it really does not seem at all like Jones behaved better than Smith. So he says the conventional doctrine must be false. That means the support that the opponents of physician-assisted suicide have crumbles away. So that's Rachel's first step of his kind of overall strategy, argumentative strategy. And then he moves forward with his own argument for physician-assisted suicide. So I'm calling this the argument from transitivity on the article that I'm providing for you. It is on page 2. He doesn't call it that. I don't know if anyone calls it that, to be honest, but I'm calling it that just so that we have a name for it. We can talk about it. So here is what it is. Again, it's from page 2 of the article that I'm providing. If, for a given patient, PE and AE here stand for passive euthanasia and active euthanasia, which is too many words on the slide. So passive euthanasia is letting someone die. Active euthanasia is actively bringing about their death. So if, for a given patient, passive euthanasia is morally permissible and active euthanasia would further decrease suffering, then active euthanasia is morally permissible. In other words, if you're letting someone die to end their suffering, and active euthanasia would speed that process up, ending their suffering even more quickly, more dramatically, faster, more effectively, then it seems pretty obvious that active euthanasia is as okay as passive euthanasia. In some cases where passive euthanasia is okay, active euthanasia would further minimize pain. So Rachel is saying there's clearly cases where this applies. Maybe not every case of a terminal illness, but certainly some cases. Therefore, in those cases, active euthanasia is morally permissible. So if the whole idea behind letting someone die is mercy, well then hastening their death is even more merciful. Letting someone die, let's just say in some cases requires letting the disease take its toll or no longer providing any substance through a feeding tube. That means they still have to starve to death. That seems like extra unnecessary pain. So active euthanasia would end all that. You wouldn't have to let them starve to death. You wouldn't let the disease take its toll. You just, once you make a decision, or once the patient makes a decision, you can just end the suffering right there through a peaceful and painful death. Painless death. So that's the idea that Rachel's is putting forward here. And two things should be said before I leave Rachel's argument and start critiquing his views. One of them is that he is assuming the conventional doctrine is the main argument against physician-assisted suicide. Now we're going to see that's not the case. So that is something we'll see in the next section. But the second thing is this: he is making a good point in that we need to really see if there's a moral difference between letting someone die and actively bringing about their death. Now, it might be the case that Smith and Jones, that scenario doesn't really prove anything, but it is an open question here at least. I mean, if we're deciding passive euthanasia is okay, then why not active euthanasia? What is the real moral difference here? So it's kind of he's pointing to an important question that must be addressed. So the most obvious problem, if we're just looking at the case of Smith and Jones, is is this question right here? Is this really analogous? Is this whole scenario that he gave you really sufficiently similar to a medical scenario? So the way I worded it is this: is the Smith-Jones-Nice scenario sufficiently similar to a scenario which includes a pro-euthanasia doctor, an anti-euthanasia doctor, and a terminally ill patient, so as to draw conclusions from it? I mean, it just really seems like the Smith and Jones scenario was designed to kind of prime your moral intuitions to say both Smith and Jones are monsters. But it's not clear that that is actually the conclusion you would, derive from a scenario in the medical field, right? Someone that's pro-euthanasia, a doctor that's pro-euthanasia, and one that's anti-euthanasia. It's not as easy to see that they're both monsters. I mean, doctors in general, I know some people object sometimes that doctors only go into the profession for the money. That might be true. But doctors in general, or at least some doctors, they're not there making decisions about, a terminally ill patient kind of on a whim. They're putting a lot of thought into this. It doesn't seem like kind of callous, monstrous behavior. So it might be argued that the Smith-Jones, scenario is really not like an active euthanasia scenario in a medical setting. So we really can't draw conclusions from it. So that's one problem relating directly to Rachel's arguments. There are other objections, and we're going to cover each of these in more depth in the next section. But just think about these for a second. And these are from some modern day advocates or opponents to physician-assisted suicide. So Alexander Snyder, an attorney with Life Legal Defense Foundation and critic of the law, said, "There is no way to determine whether a patient was coerced into taking the drug." So maybe a doctor or family members essentially manipulated the patient into saying, "Yes, I want suicide. I want to end my life." So because of that, because of this risk, essentially, that coercion is even possible, maybe we shouldn't allow for this to be the case. This is a slippery slope. As soon as we allow physician-assisted suicide to even be a possibility, then it might lead to these situations where patients are basically manipulated into committing suicide. So she continues, "It's really tragic that doctors are now thinking that the best they can do for a patient is to give them a handful of barbiturates and leave them to their own devices." So there is a line from Alexander Snyder. So that is definitely a worry, and I'm referring to this in the next section as the slippery slope argument. So you can learn more about that coming up. But also think about this objection, which I don't actually spend too much time on in this lesson. Another objection is that the cost may be prohibitive for some. In other words, not all who qualify would be able to afford the end-of-life medication. So here we have pictured, I believe her name is Brittany, and she's, had a pretty famous case She was an ally of the Right to Die movement, and she lived in California before the death with dignity laws were a part of the legislature. And in any case, she actually moved to the Pacific Northwest to have her end of life medication given to her, and and then eventually she did end her life. What is being brought up here, though, is that she was, it seems, relatively affluent. I mean, if you can just pick up and leave and get all of that processed, then it seems like you have a little of at least if you're capable of doing that, that's something that a lot of people can't do. I mean, we know people who can't even move, one city over because they just can't afford that process. So maybe that'll be the case with this end-of-life medication. Some people will want it but can't afford it. Maybe that's not fair. So maybe the fact that there's an inequity there is a reason against the law or the practice in general. Relatedly, advocates for seniors and the disabled argued it could make people vulnerable to greedy relatives or guilty consciences, since the end-of-life medication might be cheaper than life-saving treatment. So now that we're talking about money, well, there's two sides to this one right here. So maybe greedy relatives, maybe greedy isn't, the right word, but stingy relatives, they're thinking to themselves, well, the end-of-life medication is going to be cheaper than continuing this treatment. So let's just try to convince them to get that end-of-life medication. So here's that, manipulation, coercion aspect of it that we just talked about. The second part of it is this, though. Let's just, say that I'm terminally ill, and I know that it's going to cost an arm and a leg to try to, get life-saving treatment. Maybe it's possible, but I know that the end-of-life medication will be cheaper. I might, just to not burden my family with all these costs, I might choose the end-of-life medication, right? I would feel guilty to not do that. What if I just die anyway, and I ended up, costing them way more than I had to? So that might, compel me to actually choose the end-of-life medication over life-saving treatment. So this is, again, a money thing. My family is just not that affluent. So they can't afford, several tens of thousands of dollars in medical costs. So that is yet another reason to maybe be opposed to this practice, at least in the medical situation in the United States in the beginning of the 21st century. Who knows what's going to happen in the future, but at least as of now, people do go bankrupt over their medical bills. So this is a legitimate concern here in the U.S. One more objection that we'll cover in more detail in the next section, but some object that physician-assisted suicide is counter to what the function of a doctor is. That's just not what doctors are supposed to do. So we'll cover that in more detail coming up.